Hello?
Hello. This is George Ball.
Yes, George.
Tom Mann is on with me.
Hi, Tom.
A quick rundown of the situation in Brazil. We had a meeting this morning with Bob McNamara and Max Taylor and General O'Mara, who's come up overnight. And we decided on the basis of the information that had come in this morning, go ahead and start a naval task force out, but with no commitment, so that it'll be steaming down in that direction. It couldn't get into the area before April 10th, and in the meantime we can watch the developments and see whether it should go on or not. But it can be done in a way that doesn't create any kind of public stir. The second thing is I've located some Navy tankers in Aruba, and the big thing that they're going to need if they have a successful revolt down there at some point probably is some gasoline, both for motor vehicles and for the aviation. The tankers are going to be loaded, but again, they can't be down there till around April the 8th to the 13th, but this is a precautionary move that we're taking. Third is they're getting together a shipment of ammunition, but this will have to wait before we start moving it, because it'll probably have to be moved by plane, and that can only be done after the situation is verified, and we clearly decided to make a commitment in the situation. Now, what is actually happening on the field is very confused. We just had a teletype conversation with Link Gordon in Rio. It seems clear that the state just north of Rio, which is Minas Gerais, is in revolt. Both the Army and the civilian authorities of the state seem to be acting together, and the Army has apparently moved in and blocked the road from Rio so that the First Army in Rio couldn't move up and stop the revolt. We're waiting for some clarification of the situation in Sao Paulo, which is a key to the matter. There's apparently been no movement in Sao Paulo, but there's some expected at almost any moment, and we should know within the next few hours what's happening. The hope there would be that the Second Army would move and block the roads from Rio down and isolate Rio. And in the meantime, they have drafted an impeachment in congressional circles of Goulart, but there's been no action taken on it, but they've listed all the offenses against the Constitution which they allege. And there's a lot of bickering around to see what could be done, presumably, in the way of forming some kind of a rump civilian government which would have a clear legitimacy. The anti-Goulart governors are apparently going to meet Wednesday, and on the basis of the information that Gordon has, there's a significant number of the governors who are prepared to move against Goulart, about 9 of them altogether, which is a very impressive number.
How many do they have?
Total number of states there is about, how many altogether? 19.
20?
No, 21, they tell me.
Yeah.
But these are the big ones. These are the important states, which is the Now, we have instructed Gordon not to take any more contact with the Brazilians till we see how the situation develops. I think there has to be some more movement in Sao Paulo to make sure that this thing is going to move, and we don't want to get ourselves committed before we know how the thing is going to come out. He feels that on the basis of the momentum that's been started so far, it can wait for 12 hours before anything has to be, or overnight, before we have to take any decision on whether we should or shouldn't move. And I think that we can see the developments and then make a judgment on it. I gather you're planning on coming back to us tonight.
Yeah, I'll be in there about 8:30.
Right. Well, we may have another meeting this afternoon with McNamara, but in any event, we'll be changing this information. But I did want you to know the situation.
I think we ought to take every step that we can, be prepared to do everything that we need to do, just as we were in Panama, if that is at all feasible.
Right. But we're canvassing all the possibilities to make sure we're not...
I'd put everybody that had any imagination or ingenuity in the Gordon's outfit, or McCone's, or Yaw's, or McNamara's, and we just can't take this one, and I'd get right on top of it and stick my neck out a little.
Right. Well, this is just our own feeling about it, and we've gotten this well organized, I think, now.
April 1st, 1964, Rio de Janeiro. Tanks roll through the streets, President Goulart flees the country, and a military junta seizes power. The American press celebrates it as a victory for democracy. The New York Times writes that a coup eliminated the immediate communist threat. But that's not really what happened there. What actually happened was this. For 3 years, the CIA had systematically worked to destroy Goulart's government. They had infiltrated labor unions. They had funded opposition politics. They had spread propaganda. They manipulated the economy to create chaos. They trained military officers to think like right-wing Americans. They spent nearly $20 million. That's almost $200 million in today's money. When it was over, the U.S. Embassy sent a cable back to Washington. He wrote that American support, both moral and material, had been essential to maintain the backbone of the Brazilian resistance. Translation: we made this happen. The Brazilian operation had created a template, a playbook, 6 different ways to attack a government at the same time. Run all 6 tracks together and you could overthrow a government without anyone knowing that America was involved. By 1981, that playbook was over 17 years old. Proven, dusty, ready to try again. This is the Suriname Contra affair, Part 3, the Brazil Blueprint. My name is Matthew Smith, and I grew up next door to the dictator in Suriname that this story is all about. In the last episode, we showed you that the Reagan administration had built a shadow government, a parallel system of legal authority to wage secret wars without having to ask Congress for approval. Let me recap a couple of key points from the last episode. You'll need to understand them to understand what follows next. And if you haven't checked out that episode, go ahead and click the link and check it out now. The Reagan administration, with Vice President George Bush in charge, created new committees and special groups that Bush himself chaired or ran. Things like the Special Situation Group, the Crisis Pre-Planning Groups. These weren't your normal cabinet meetings. No congressional oversight, no public disclosure. They were shadow structures where the real decisions were being made. And they did this really for 3 reasons. First, the CIA had been under heavy scrutiny since the Church Committee. Congress had exposed assassination programs and illegal operations and spying on Americans. The old methods weren't working anymore. Secondly, when the CIA asked Congress to let them invade countries like Suriname and Grenada in the summer of 1981, the Senate had said no, you don't have enough justification. Third, these structures gave Bush direct control. He worked with what he liked to call can-do cowboys, people like Oliver North who would do whatever it took to get the job done in the fight against communism. To cover their tracks, they changed the rules about secrecy. They made it easy to classify things and call them secret. They made sure that secrets would stay secrets for longer. And here's the crazy part. They even took information that had already been made public and decided to reclassify it as secret again. The Reagan administration started replacing traditional diplomats, people who were trained in negotiation and compromise, out. In their place, it would be loyalists who could get messy, people who could do things, in the words of one official, like go whoring and drinking with Bouterza. People with CIA training in psychological warfare and destabilization, intelligence gathering. These operatives were being sent into Suriname to put pressure on the Bouterza regime. And finally, we discussed a critical presidential directive called NSDD-17. Think of it like a secret presidential order. NSDD-17 said, don't just contain Cuban and Soviet influence, push it back, roll it back. The method was to provide money, weapons, training, and support to pro-democracy fighters. In Nicaragua, those fighters became known as the Contras. But in Suriname, because of Reagan's secret system, these fighters have remained relatively unknown. Until now. In this episode, we're going to explore the methods of pressure that the Reagan administration used against Bouterza, an old blueprint for a regime change that the U.S. had been using for decades. To understand what they had planned in Suriname, you really need to understand what had worked in Brazil and Guatemala and elsewhere around Central and South America for the previous decades. The 1964 coup in Brazil looked spontaneous. It looked like the Brazilian military acting on their own to save their country from communism. But the classified documents tell a different story. The CIA used international banks to create economic crisis. There's an organization called the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which is like a bank but for countries. The IMF loans money, but they demand that governments cut spending and they raise taxes. So when Brazil's President Goulart resisted those demands, the loans got cut off and the economy collapsed, and everyone blamed Goulart's communist policies. But the crisis was being manufactured by the CIA. The CIA secretly funded 1,000 opposition politicians. They used fake organizations that looked legitimate. One was called the IBAD, the Brazilian Institute of Democratic Action. They spent $20 million creating the appearance that Brazil had massive organized opposition to Goulart. The CIA then created fake labor organizations to train anti-Goulart union leaders. These trainees became, as one historian found, as, quote, intimately involved in some of the clandestine operations of the revolution before it took place. In other words, the CIA had trained union leaders to help overthrow the government. Track 4, propaganda operations. CIA front groups. The fake organizations that actually looked kind of real. They spread anti-communist propaganda. They convinced Brazilian business leaders and the middle class that Goulart was an existential threat. Track 5, you had military infiltration. The U.S. trained Brazilian military officers in American war colleges. They indoctrinated these officers with right-wing pro-American ideology, so when the coup time came, these officers were ready. Track 6, they used strategic pressure. The U.S. suspended aid and credit. This created more crisis conditions that made military intervention look necessary to restore stability. So the whole beauty of the Brazilian model was its deniability. When the coup succeeded, it looked like Brazil had done it themselves. But it wasn't spontaneous. It was systematic. And by 1981, the Reagan administration had people who had studied this model for their entire career. Constantine Menges, who I mistakenly pronounced as Menges in the previous episode, literally had written the book on this stuff. So in 1968, just 4 years after Brazil, Menges published a study with a think tank called the RAND Corporation. His paper was titled Democratic Revolutionary Insurgency as an Alternative Strategy. So here was his big idea. When you directly support corrupt dictators, you often end up strengthening the very communist movements you're trying to defeat. So his alternative was smarter. He said you support democratic revolutionary forces that could fight both communists and the dictators at the same time. So his strategy was you got to make them feel the pain in the country a little bit. So wait 6 months to a year after the communist government takes power. Let them screw things up a little bit. Let the population experience what it's like to live under the, quote, consequences of communist economic policy. And then when people are angry and disappointed, your resistance organization starts to make its move. Now, in September of 1981, CIA Director Casey appointed Menges as National Intelligence Officer for Latin America. That's a senior intelligence position focused on analyzing the threats in that area. And Suriname fit Menges' model perfectly. Bouterza had been struggling for 18 months. The economy was struggling. The political situation was chaotic. You had President Chin Sen fighting with Bouterza. The radical leftist Palu Party was alienating some of the moderates in the country. In Menges' framework, Suriname was right on schedule. It was time to deploy the resistance. Now, when people hear about CIA operations, usually you're thinking about spies and assassination and coup attempts, right? But one of the CIA's most effective weapons has been labor unions. So the story begins right after the Cuban Revolution. Castro had just seized power, and American labor unions or labor leaders were terrified that communism was going to spread throughout the Western Hemisphere. So in 1961, the AFL-CIO, that's America's big union organization, created something called the American Institute for Free Labor Development. They called it AIFLD for short. So on paper, AIFLD was about promoting free trade unionism in Latin America, helping workers organize for better pay and conditions. So typical labor stuff, right? But you got to look who showed up to design the original organization. AFL-CIO President George Meany, Nelson Rockefeller's associate, and J. Peter Grace, who was the head of one of the biggest corporate conglomerates operating in Latin America. So you have labor union leaders, Rockefeller associates, and one of the biggest corporate magnates in Latin America. So this wasn't about helping workers so much as it was about protecting American business interests. They proposed creating a nonprofit that would bring Latin American unionists to the United States for training. Then they would fund them for 9 months of anti-communist organizing when they returned back home. They'd also established these regional training centers in Latin America to identify which students specifically should get advanced training in the United States. The idea was simple. You train union leaders who would oppose communist influence, but also simultaneously support American business interests. President John F. Kennedy had just launched the Alliance for Progress, which was a massive $20 billion economic aid program for Latin America over 10 years, which was a direct response to the Cuban Revolution. The idea was to flood Latin America with American money and technological assistance to prevent even more countries from going communist. Kennedy's Secretary of Labor, Arthur Goldberg, had previously run the OSS labor desk. The OSS is the precursor to the CIA during World War II, and he knew how to weaponize labor organizations for intelligence purposes. So Goldberg helped the Kennedy administration work with the AFL-CIO to promote non-communist development in Latin America. In January of 1962, they formed a committee to bringing together the Department of Labor, the AFL-CIO, and USAID. So top CIA officials were involved, though not as formal members of the committee. So money started flowing from the U.S. government, millions of dollars annually to fund these AIFLD organizations, and AIFLD started as an autonomous labor initiative, but willfully it became an instrument of U.S. foreign policy. So by 1978, AIFLD claimed it had trained 338,000 union members across Latin America. They had offices in 18 different countries. And one of AIFLD's sponsors, a business magnate, Peter Grace, he explained the real purpose when he said AIFLD, quote, teaches workers to help increase their company's businesses. Which is really interesting if you think about that for a second. I mean, that's literally opposite of what unions normally do. Unions are normally fighting companies to get higher wages for employees. They're not out to help companies make more profit. But that was the point. AIFLD existed to create pro-business, anti-communist union leaders who would oppose leftist organizations. In Brazil, AIFLD trained operatives were instrumental in the 1964 coup. So labor historian Jeff Shirky documented that these trainees became intimately involved with some of the clandestine operations of the revolution. So after the coup had succeeded, real union leaders, the ones who had actually fought for the workers, were imprisoned and tortured and murdered. The AIFLD trained, quote, democratic unionists, they took their place. They had been working with the military the whole time. So check out what AIFLD director William Doherty would admit years later that had happened in Brazil.
Says Mr. Doherty, quote, what happened in Brazil on April 1st did not just happen, it was planned, and planned months in advance. Many of the trade union leaders, some of whom were actually trained in our institute, were involved in the revolution and in the overthrow of the Goulart regime.
Immediately prior to the military takeover in Brazil, there was a group of students from Brazilian unions in training in Front Royal. This wasn't the first of the Brazilian groups that have been here, nor has it been the last. We've had them continuously. They weren't in any kind of a course training for revolutionary activities or clandestine activities. They were in a regular collective bargaining course. It so happens that when many of those students went back home from that course, their unions were involved in this struggle against the attempt of the communists to take over some of the unions, and that's precisely what I meant by the statement.
Right after Doherty's interview, another guy comes on who's Richard Martinez, who was a CIA AIFLD operative in Brazil. And he talks about the money situation. He specifically came in and was talking about meeting with the CIA, who told him, don't keep any books on this. We don't want any records that could tie it back to us. So he would travel with vast amounts of cash. He said that they would burn out the communist headquarters, and they burned up the whole damn building. And after the coup, they just locked up the Union leaders, put them on ships, threw away the key. Didn't really know what happened to them afterwards. They talked about there was an American fleet, which we heard at the very beginning of the call on the audio, that was waiting off the coast on standby where the Marines would land and support the coup forces where needed. So I just want you to remember this as we start to go into some other details, because this is all going to sound very familiar in short order. Interestingly enough, the exact same time that Doherty's trainees were learning collective bargaining in Brazil, another U.S. government operative was there. Edward J. Donovan was an English instructor, but he was actually infiltrating student strike movements, identifying leaders by name, and reporting back and filing intelligence reports, just months before the coup. I'll tell you a little bit more about him later. So the same pattern played out in Chile 9 years later. AIFLD operatives helped to organize the truckers' strike that paralyzed Salvador Allende's government in 1973. That strike created the conditions for Pinochet's military coup. So thousands of Chilean union leaders were subsequently killed. The AIFLD-trained leaders survived. Why? Because they'd been collaborating with the coup plotters. In September 1981, a man arrived in Paramaribo. His name was Daal Miller Povenmire. His title was Labor Advisor for Bureau of Inter-American Affairs. His mission was a week-long assessment of Suriname's labor movement and opposition networks. But 2 years earlier, a magazine called Counterspy had identified Povenmire as something else entirely. Counterspy wasn't a conspiracy theory publication. It was run by Philip Agee, who was an author and former CIA agent who had turned against the agency. He spent years identifying intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover, and he was disturbingly accurate. In April of 1979, Counterspy published an article called Brazil and the CIA, which was a comprehensive expose of the United States and how it had helped to overthrow President Goulart and install a military dictatorship through torture and terror. Now, at the end of the article, Counterspy had identified a list, not of CIA officers, but of people who they called CIA collaborators in Brazil as of August 1978. Now, the intro to the list was really precise. It said, quote, "The following U.S. government employees have collaborated or worked with the CIA in a functional capacity." And one name that's on the list is Daal Povenmire, Labor Officer, Sao Paulo. And then they laid out his career like a prosecutor presenting evidence. His career kind of reads like an operational manual from the CIA. So he was born in 1930, Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where America trains diplomats and key intelligence analysts. He spent 3 years in the United States Naval Intelligence. He joined the State Department in 1957. He was in Chile from 1958 to 1960, where he had built relationships with copper mine union leaders. One of his key contacts was a guy named Orlando Letelier. Letelier would later become Allende's foreign minister. In 1976, Chilean intelligence assassinated him while he was in Washington, D.C. with a car bomb. He had a brief stint in Zanzibar in 1961 through 1963. They were opening a new consulate on the eve of independence. The CIA analysts were predicting a new African Cuba. So Povenmire left there in 1963, and 2 months later, there was revolution, massacres, and the government immediately recognized by Moscow and Beijing. Paraguay was the next place Povenmire went during the Stroessner military dictatorship, where he successfully established AIFLD training programs. After that, he was at the Pentagon from 1968 to 1969, a representative at the National Military Command Center. the war room. So it was a 24/7 hub for monitoring nuclear threats and coordinating U.S. military operations worldwide. So not just a job for a run-of-the-mill diplomat. Then Venezuela, where he brought AIFLD operations back after the organization had been thrown out of the country for its political activities, which is a polite way of saying that you're kicked out for running CIA operations. From 1974 to 1978, he was actually the first ever USA labor attaché to Portugal. So he was sent there urgently after the Carnation Revolution, and his mission was to prevent the powerful Moscow-backed Communist Party from taking over a NATO country. Sound kind of familiar, right? So Povenmire later recalled this being, quote, where I made a major contribution. So translation, he helped to stop a communist takeover. And finally, he ends up in Sao Paulo in 1978 through 1981, where he arrives just as massive strikes are shaking Brazil's military dictatorship. So Counter-Spy did not need to prove that Povenmire carried around a CIA badge with him. They were more making a sophisticated argument. You know, look at his career, look at these assignments, look at the pattern. This is what CIA collaboration looks like in practice. The distinction between State Department intelligence analyst and CIA operative is bureaucratic, not really a functional distinction. And in this case, in Zanzibar, in Portugal, in Brazil, that distinction was pretty much meaningless. What mattered is what hostile governments would see. And they would see exactly what Counter-Spy saw, which is a man whose entire career had demonstrated systematic collaboration with intelligence operations. And in 1981, everybody knew what happened when Philip Agee identified someone. So November of that year, just 2 years after Povenmire had arrived in Suriname, Agee did it again. At a press conference in Managua, Nicaragua, he named 10 alleged CIA agents who were operating out of the embassy there. And what followed was brutal. So 4 officials identified by name in a pro-government newspaper. Armed men began following them. They were breaking into their homes. Between November 6th and December 13th, 3 women were assaulted in their homes. They were overpowered by attackers and bound and gagged. The U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee later cited these incidents as ways to illustrate the direct violence and consequences of publicly exposing identities of intelligence agents. That was the cost of the exposure. And that's what happens when your cover gets blown in a hostile country. So in 1981, September, when Povenmire visited, he had been publicly identified by Counter-Spy 2 years earlier as someone who had collaborated and worked with the CIA in a functional capacity. And then he traveled to Suriname. So at the request of the Bureau of International Affairs, he made this week-long assessment of the deteriorating political situation. The department was really concerned. So for 14 months after the February coup, Bouterse was consolidating power, democratic institutions being dismantled, opposition leaders were being intimidated, and Washington needed to understand the landscape, particularly the labor movement. Because if there was going to be any pressure put on Bouterse, if there was going to be any organized opposition that was capable of forcing democratic reforms, it had to be a groundswell of popular support, and he had to get the masses behind it. And that meant you had to get the unions behind it. So Povenmire met with the labor leaders. He assessed the organizational capacity. He mapped out the networks. He met with one man specifically who's going to become a very important player in this story, and that is Cyril Daal. So Daal headed Suriname's major trade union confederation, the Motorbond. And I probably butchered that again, so apologies to all you watching my Dutch. We'll just call it the Mother Union, because that's what it translates to in English. So Daal was one of a number of community leaders who was publicly calling for a return for a democratic government. He was articulate, he was organized, and he was courageous. So Povenmire talked with Daal. He talked with the people who worked with him. He assessed the Confederation's strengths, its political orientations, and its capacity to mobilize. And then he went back to Washington and filed his report. Now, decades later, in an oral history interview, Povenmire described what he had recommended. He said, quote, "My report recommended ways in which international labor support could be directed towards Suriname." Ways that labor support could be directed. Now, that's diplomatic speak, but what the meaning is clear. Here's the networks, here are the leaders, here's how to mobilize them, and here's how to apply the pressure. So track 3 was operational and ready to go. Years later, Povenmire started reflecting on his career and on the people he had worked with and the networks he had helped build, the labor leaders that who had trusted him. And he ended up asking a question in an interview that really was haunting him, which was, he says, it was always a delicate matter, knowing whether you're being helpful or endangering the people that you're working with. He offered a principle that he lived by, which was, the important thing is not to mislead people into thinking that we'll help them if we really can't do it. So you got to think about what he was saying there and about what he knew at the time. In September of 1981, a man who was identified in Counterspy as being a CIA collaborator met with Cyril Daal, a labor leader who was organizing opposition to a military dictator. So the question is, did Bauderza know about the Counterspy article? Did his intelligence services, which were closely working with Nicaragua and Cuba, have files on Povenmire? When somebody identified as a CIA liaison meets with opposition labor leaders, what does that signal if you're a paranoid government? 14 months later, in December of 1982, Bauderza's soldiers came for Daal. They came for 15 opposition leaders, journalists, labor leaders, attorneys, university professors, military officers. They were arrested, they were taken to Fort Zeelandia, tortured, and then executed. And Cyril Daal was one of those who was murdered along with 14 others. And when Bauderza justified those killings, he said he was doing it to stop a CIA plot. But Povenmire wasn't operating in a vacuum. The ambassador he was reporting to, John Crowley Jr., had his own deep background in labor operations. Crowley had spent 1959 to 1960 at the University of Wisconsin taking advanced labor and economic studies. So that's the same institution that trained many of the AIFLD operatives in how to use unions in foreign policy objectives. Then he had served as the labor and political officer in Brussels during the height of the Cold War labor battles in Europe. He'd been deputy chief of mission in the Dominican Republic after the 1965 USA invasion, helping to stabilize the country using labor organizations. And most recently, he'd been DSM in Caracas, Venezuela, dealing with the oil industry's labor movements and the Cuban influence. So when Crowley arrived in Suriname in July of 1980, just 5 months after Bauderza's coup, it wasn't a random assignment. The State Department had positioned a labor specialist as ambassador exactly at the moment when labor operations would become critical. For 18 months from July of 1980 through December of 1981, Crowley helped build the labor infrastructure that would later become weaponized. The timing is particularly significant. Povenmire's assessment happened right when Bauderza returned from Cuba and announced the Revolutionary Front's formation. American intelligence was mapping the opposition at exactly the moment when the opposition was about to face repression. But in September 1981, the labor operation was just getting started. The AFL-CIO's involvement in Suriname wasn't theoretical. By 1980s, the organization was rapidly expanding operations across Latin America. So you have this weird situation. At home, you have a FL-CIO promoting Buy American nationalism. They blamed foreign workers for American plant closures. But abroad, they were sabotaging workers' struggles. Labor journalist Jeff Shirky documented this in his history book called The Blue Collar Empire. He explained, quote, the AFL-CIO has never made formal acknowledgement of its historical crimes abroad and continues to keep its rank and file members in the dark about its operations. So why the secrecy? Because they were still running the same operations. The Brazil model's labor track was alive and well, and Suriname was up next. But there's another layer to the story that makes it even more complex. Cyril Daal's mother union wasn't just any labor union. It was affiliated with the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, the ICFTU. According to former CIA officer Philip Agee, who worked on labor operations and later exposed them in his book Inside the Company, CIA Diary, the ICFTU received covert CIA support throughout the Cold War. Agee documented that the CIA guided and supported ICFTU at 3 levels: international, regional, and national. At the top, AFL-CIO President George Meany, Foreign Affairs Chief Jay Lovestone, and European Representative Irving Brown, all working closely with the CIA to counter Soviet influence in labor movements worldwide. The ICFTU established regional organizations. In Latin America, it was called ORIT. the Inter-America Regional Organization of Workers. These regional bodies coordinated with national trade union centers. Blue Collar Empire documents how millions of CIA dollars flowed through the AFL-CIO and ICFTU to support anti-communist labor activities in Latin America and elsewhere. Now, this doesn't mean that Cyril Daal was a CIA asset. I want to be clear, I'm not saying that. There's no evidence as of yet to state that. Daal appears to have been a genuine labor leader fighting for workers' rights in democratic government. But it does mean that Daal's union existed within a global network that was influenced and financially supported by the CIA through the AFL-CIO and the ICFTU. So when Povenmire recommended, quote, ways in which international labor support could be directed towards Suriname, he was recommending support through CIA-connected channels, whether or not Daal knew it or not. This placed the Mother Union within the sphere of Cold War interest, which sought to promote anti-communist labor unions and labor movements as a buffer against left-wing influence. While Povenmire was mapping out the union networks, another track was being prepared, one that would prove most effective, and that's economic warfare. So in 2018, this man became President Trump's national security advisor. His name was John Bolton, the guy with the mustache who publicly advocated for bombing Iran and North Korea. He lasted 17 months before Trump fired him for being too aggressive, too eager for military action, too willing to start wars. But in 1981, John Bolton was just a nobody, just a 32-year-old lawyer who'd been practicing corporate law at a Washington firm called Covington & Burling. What he had was connections and ideology. He was a protege of Senator Jesse Helms, who was one of the most hardcore conservative senators in Washington. Helms hated the UN, he hated foreign aid, he hated any international treaty that limited American power. And in January of 1981, Bolton had got a job that perfectly suited his beliefs. He was general counsel for the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. Now, if you're thinking, what's a general counsel and why does that matter? Well, stay with me here, because this is where Bolton had learned the skill that would end up defining his entire career. How to use bureaucratic legal authority as a weapon to achieve your political objectives. So let me explain what USAID was supposed to do. It was created in 1961 by a Kennedy administration. Its mission was to help poor countries develop, build roads, build agriculture, fight disease, education programs, things like that. Kind of like America's official charity organization. We send money and experts to help developing countries in hopes that they would lift themselves out of poverty. So there was the Foreign Assistance Act, a law that created USAID. It said the purpose was alleviating poverty, promoting self-sustaining economic growth and equitable distribution, and encouraging the protection of civil and economic rights. That's the official mission. Development, human aid. But there's always this tension, right? Because foreign aid can also be used as leverage. And if a country is dependent on American money, you can threaten to cut it off to get what you want. Suriname knew a lot about this because of the Dutch foreign aid package. You can also structure aid programs that favor American businesses. You can use, quote, development projects as cover for intelligence gathering. So during the Cold War, this kind of tension is always there. And most USAID officers were genuine development professionals who cared about helping people. And then Reagan arrived. And people like John Bolton were sent to USAID with a very different mission. So here's what the Reagan administration understood. You can't openly use the CIA to overthrow governments anymore because of the Church Committee, and the Congress is watching too closely now with all the assassination programs and now spying on Americans. But you could use USAID. It's lily white, it's clean, and that's the beauty of it. It's completely legal. It's overt. State Department officers running aid programs, nothing secret about it, right? If you could structure these programs in the right way, you could achieve covert objectives. And this is what the intelligence operatives call a dual track operation. So track one, you've got your overt mission. USAID sending development and democratic initiatives and personnel. In track two, you've got your covert objective. The same aid that creates dependency, builds intelligence. Networks, funds political opposition, creates pressure points for economic warfare. The same programs, two different purposes. So So if you remember the Brazil model we were talking about, track one was economic warfare. CIA manipulated the IMF to cut off loans and create economic chaos. Then they blamed the Brazil's leftist president for the collapse. 1981, that track had evolved now. So the CIA couldn't manipulate the international banks quite as openly as they used to. There was a little more scrutiny. So the Reagan administration found USAID as another alternative. So you just use American foreign aid to create the dependency, structure programs to advance U.S. political objectives, and then threaten to cut off the aid as leverage. Same principle as Brazil, just a different legal mechanism. And that's when somebody like John Bolton gets involved. So as general counsel, it was Bolton's job to supposedly make sure that the USAID programs were following the law, legal compliance, all that kind of good stuff. But Bolton had bigger aspirations. He saw his position differently. He saw it as like a checkpoint, a way to get leverage in politics. So every program had to get a legal sign-off before the money could be spent. And that meant Bolton could block any programs that he didn't like. He could demand rewrites. He could raise legal objections that were really political objections. So there's this one diplomat who worked with USAID at the time, Ambassador Teresa Toll. She remembers a specific incident where she was trying to continue an existing program, a standard bureaucratic process, but then Bolton intervened. So she said John Bolton at the time was with AID. I think he was general counsel. But USAID had money and had to get sign-off. But now John Bolton would not approve the continuation of this program. And I said, why not? Why in the world? That kind of confusion, that why in the world, tells you everything. So the legal reason Bolton gave her didn't make sense because the reason wasn't legal, it was political. He was blocking programs that he didn't think served the Reagan administration's anti-communist agenda. Another colleague who worked in USAID's budget office, Leonard Rogers, remembered Bolton differently than other general counsels before. He called Bolton a conservative lightning rod who seemed to like the role even back then. So Bolton wasn't trying to stay neutral. He was trying to use his legal authority to enforce his ideology. And here's the thing. Bolton was completely open about this approach. Years later in interviews, he described his philosophy clearly.
Why are you so opposed to this?
Because I think properly directed, USAID and a bilateral foreign assistance program can enhance American national security. It's throughout history, begin with reading Caesar's commentaries about how he used economic means in the conquest of Gaul. There is a lot to criticize about AID. There's no doubt about it. But the approach that the administration is taking reminds me of that Army briefing officer in Vietnam who said we had to destroy that village in order to save it. And I might say I've got some personal experience here. I was in charge of policy and budget at USAID during the Reagan administration when we undertook a major effort to fix it. And I'm going to show you my farewell present from AID. You can see it's a hand grenade, and it says on it, John R. Bolton, truest Reaganaut. AID 1983. This is a style of government, and that's the way we approached it.
Well, hang on, John. If you don't mind me saying, I mean, giving you a grenade as a leaving present, people could say that was sending another message altogether.
Well, it was a style of government. We felt that AID needed to be shaken up, and I'm sure it needs to be shaken up today. But when you destroy it, you're eliminating an important instrument that we need. If you want to cut the budget and redirect it, that's fine. What I would do would be to eliminate all American contributions to the World Bank and the multilateral development banks, and much of the contributions we make to the UN system. I think the U.S. benefits by the direct bilateral provision of foreign aid much, much more than to these multilateral institutions. We get no credit for what they do, despite our paying 25% roughly of their budgets. We get the credit or we get the blame when we do it directly through our own bilateral program.
Just recently, he said this about foreign aid in general. Quote, a well-run foreign aid program is trying to help our friends, persuade others to become friends. How you spend it in a country is open to debate, but nobody talks about are we spending enough in the right countries to advance American interests. So let that sink in for just a second. It's all about the right countries, advance American interest, That's not development, that's not humanitarianism, that's geopolitics. And Bolton's been saying this for 40 years. So in 1981, he was already operating from this kind of philosophy. Foreign aid isn't charity. It's a weapon, you give it to friends, you withhold it from your enemies. So the Foreign Assistance Act that said USAID should alleviate poverty and promote human rights, Bolton could interpret that same statute through his own ideological lens. He could find clauses about national security, prohibition on aid to countries with human rights violations, and waivers that gave the president discretion. The law was broad enough so that a determined lawyer could make it say almost anything. And that's exactly what Bolton did. He weaponized the ambiguity. If a program might indirectly benefit a leftist government, Bolton could find a legal reason to block it. If a program supported democracy promotion in a way that undermined America's enemies, Bolton made sure that that one got approved. Same statute, different interpretations, all depending on whether the program advanced American interests. So in late 1981, Bolton traveled to Suriname. Bolton wasn't hiding what he was doing. As he was conducting his Suriname assessment, he was publicly advocating for what he called supply-side foreign assistance. Quote, "We at AID," Bolton explained, "are vigorous advocates of supply-side foreign assistance." So, supply-side foreign assistance. That was, again, the polite term. Counterspy translated it in their article titled "The U.S. Marshall Plan for the Caribbean Counterinsurgency." The article explained what supply-side foreign assistance actually looked like. Across-the-board currency devaluations, elimination of trade restrictions, private takeover of government-owned facilities, a social compact where developing countries would agree to economic changes in exchange for aid. But it really wasn't an exchange, it was coercion. Accept our economic restructuring or get nothing. His was track one of the Brazil blueprint, articulated as official policy, and Bolton was one of its vigorous advocates. The challenge was that Suriname had never received a lot of foreign aid because the Netherlands, Suriname's former colonial power, had provided a massive assistance program. Ambassador Crowley called it the highest per capita aid program in the world, sort of like conscience money. The Dutch felt guilty about colonialism, so they gave Suriname tons of money. Dutch assistance was so comprehensive that the American officials had traditionally viewed Suriname as their responsibility, but Bouterse's leftward drift had changed all of that. So if the Netherlands couldn't or wouldn't use economic leverage to control Suriname, the United States would need to develop its own capabilities. So this is all starting to sound familiar. This is track 1 and track 6 from the Brazil blueprint adapted for 1981. Economic warfare in Brazil, CIA used the IMF to create chaos. In Suriname, Bolton would try to see if he could use a USAID and the threat of its withdrawal. Strategic pressure. In Brazil, they suspended aid to create crisis conditions. In Suriname, Bolton was establishing aid programs specifically so that they could suspend them later as leverage. You can't cut off aid unless you have some aid, if it doesn't exist. So Bolton's job was to create the dependency that would make future threats more credible. So Bolton returned back to the United States with recommendations. The programs that they established were pretty modest to start off with, just enough to create American economic presence, just enough to build infrastructure and for the pressure later on. But they really weren't, and this sounds cynical, but they really weren't about helping Suriname develop. They were about creating conditions for what came next, which was the Caribbean Basin Initiative. So a few months later, in February of 1982, just months after Bolton's visit, Reagan would announce the Caribbean Basin Initiative. It was a massive economic program offering trade deals to aid Caribbean countries. Now, the only catch was they were only going to friendly nations who qualified. So countries that aligned with American interests, countries that rejected Cuba and the Soviet Union. So Suriname, with Bouterse drifting leftward, they would be excluded, punished, made an example of. And Bolton was already working on the legal architecture for that initiative. As general counsel, his office had to review how the CBI would be structured, what kind of legal criteria they would have to meet, countries would have to meet to qualify, how to write the rules so they would be reward friends and punish the enemies. This was Bolton's specialty, building legal frameworks that looked neutral on paper but were politically targeted in practice. In August of 1982, 6 months after the Caribbean Basin Initiative was announced, Bolton ended up getting a promotion. He moved from general counsel to assistant administrator of program and policy coordination. It's not a lateral move, it's an elevation to getting some more real power, which he really desired. Now, why did he get that? Well, he had proven himself. He knew how to use legal channels to achieve political objectives. He knew how to structure these aid programs that served multiple purposes all at once. A colleague, a guy named Michael Croswell, who worked in that office, remembered what Bolton did with his new authority. Bolton initiated policy papers that reframed all U.S. foreign aid with a simpler, more geopolitical framework. Economic support for key foreign policy allies, everything else was secondary. Development for development's sake, no thanks. Not if it doesn't serve American interests strategically. And here's where it all connects to something you may have heard of before, which is the Iran-Contra affair. The namesake of this entire episode, the Suriname Contra affair. The Iran-Contra scandal revealed in 1986 that Reagan's administration had been illegally selling weapons to Iran and using the profits to illegally fund the Nicaragua Contras. Oliver North was the operational guy behind the scenes, but the legal architecture that made it all possible, that's people like John Bolton. Bolton worked very closely with someone named Elliot Abrams, who ran Latin American policy at the State Department. Abrams would later be convicted of lying to Congress about the Iran-Contra scandal, and then he would become pardoned by President George H.W. Bush, vice president and former CIA director. So that's the network we're looking at. We're looking at Bolton, Abrams, Oliver North, Konstantin Menges. They're all connected. They're all part of the same operation. The USAID program that Bolton designed became the mechanism for funding the covert wars. Not directly, because that would be illegal, but through that same dual-track program. Official aid to promote democracy, actual objectives, support Contras in Nicaragua and Suriname and wherever else you would find them fighting Soviet and Cuban interests. So this is what you really need to understand. There's really not a lot of declassified documentations that are public about John Bolton's work at USAID in 1981, 1982. If you know where they are or if you've got them, please send them my way. It would help us kind of put the pieces together. But we know he was general counsel. We know he went to Suriname. We know he moved to the policy coordination role. But the actual documents, the memos that he wrote and the legal opinions that he issued and the programs he blocked, I haven't found them yet in the public record. Or they haven't been declassified. Or they were destroyed. The only real reason that we know that Bolton went to Suriname in the first place is because Ambassador Crowley happened to mention it in an oral history that was recorded decades later. And the only reason we know that he blocked the programs is because Ambassador Toll remembered it in her interview. If these diplomats hadn't been interviewed, if they hadn't had sharp memories, we wouldn't even know anything about Bolton's Suriname operation. So that absence of records, that's evidence of something. When you're running dual-track operations, legal programs with covert objectives, you don't want a paper trail. Same thing with that guy said down in Brazil. We don't want it all to come back to us. You want deniability. The archival gap that we're looking at is the smoking gun in and of itself. It proves that something was happening that someone didn't want documented.
With all due respect, one doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work.
And you cited your expertise having planned coups.
I'm not going to get into the specifics, but
successful coups?
Well, I wrote about Venezuela in the book, and it turned out not to be successful. Not that we had all that much to do with it, but I saw what it took for an opposition to try and overturn an illegally elected president, and they failed. The notion that Donald Trump was half as competent as the Venezuelan opposition is laughable. But I think there's another...
I feel like there's other stuff you're not telling me, though.
I'm sure there is.
And I'm telling you this because it's all going to matter in future episodes where you're going to hear about the Caribbean Basin Initiative in detail, about U.S. offering trade deals and aid to Caribbean countries, excluding Suriname from that. You're going to hear Suriname's leaders like Narendorp and Horb and Bouterse being very critical of the Caribbean Basin initiatives, accusing the USA of economic imperialism and using USAID as a weapon. And when you hear those critiques, you're going to want to remember John Bolton's words. Are we spending enough in the right countries to advance American interests? Surinamese leaders were not being paranoid. They weren't inventing conspiracy theories. They were describing exactly what John Bolton had been sent to do. The dual-track system was real. The weaponization of foreign aid was real. The Brazil blueprint was being applied to Suriname right there in real time. So Bolton's 1981 visit was track one, economic warfare, going operational. And Bouterse could see what was happening, which is why he made increasingly desperate decisions. When someone is trying to economically strangle your country, you don't act rationally, you act in survival mode. But economic pressure was just one component. The Reagan administration was activating all 6 tracks simultaneously. And there was one more track that required very careful preparation. And that would provide the intelligence foundation for everything else. And that was the military assessment. The military component required a different approach than the labor or the economic operations. Direct military assistance to Bouterse's government was considered impossible. He was, by now, too leftist, too friendly with Cuba. But the United States needed detailed intelligence on Suriname's military. What were their capacities and their capabilities? What were their vulnerabilities? What would an invasion potentially look like? The mechanism of figuring this all out was already in place, something called the IMET program, which is the International Military Education and Training. So the idea was simple. We trained foreign military officers in American war colleges. They learn American military doctrine. They become friendly to U.S. interests. In Suriname, IMET's funding was pretty modest, just like $38,000 for the fiscal year of 1981. There were only 2 individuals that got trained, both at the U.S. Coast Guard Officer Candidate School. But the program's real value wasn't necessarily the training, it was the access. So under the cover of evaluating IMET requirements and planning future programs, the U.S. military personnel could conduct systematic intelligence collection. They could visit military bases, they could assess capabilities, they could identify weaknesses. The intelligence requirement was urgent. If economic and political pressures failed to move Bouterse away from Cuba, the administration needed to understand their military options. In 1981, in November, a U.S. Southcom security assistance team visited Suriname. U.S. Southcom is a U.S. Southern Command, the military command that's responsible for Latin America and the Caribbean. They prepared proposals for expanding IMET's program for fiscal years 1982 through 84, based upon projected funding of about $75,000. Now, according to this report, here's where it gets really interesting. Because Suriname wasn't a one-off. Southcom was running the exact same playbook at the exact same time in El Salvador. Fall of 1981, there was a small senior Southcom team that arrives in El Salvador. Not to hand out rifles, but to assess, to map things out, and to shape the future. Their mission was identical. Figure out the capabilities, find out the vulnerabilities, and design U.S. strategy that would matter the most over the next few years. In El Salvador, that strategy became a multi-year, quote, assistance program. Bigger forces, training pipelines, better communication, and intelligence, all wrapped up into the language of making their military more professional. So different country, different politics, same Southcom playbook. The timing was also really significant. The U.S. Southcom visit happened just days before November 16th, the date that would activate the administration's shadow government authorities for the Caribbean Basin. Remember NSDD 17, right? That established the Contras. Southcom, they visited just days before that happened. So the military assessment was completed exactly the moment when the operational planning moved from theoretical to practical. The assessment had also prepared for some more extensive military involvement if needed. So the recommendations for expanded IMET programs created the the bureaucratic cover story for deeper engagement. So even if these programs never got fully implemented, the assessment process had provided detailed intelligence on Suriname's military capabilities and vulnerabilities. According to the Southern Command's annual historical report, quote, no actual training was accomplished in the remainder of the calendar year of 1981, nor were there any firm plans or commitments projected by the Suriname's military for training in the calendar year 1982. So that's pretty telling about how Bauderza and Horb and other members of the NCOs were feeling about American assistance and how cozy they were with the Cubans at that time, if they pretty much rejected all support. But again, it's the intelligence value of what their assessment collected that really mattered at this point. The military track was the most sensitive component. Unlike the labor or the economic aid, the military assessment clearly implied potential intervention. But it's also essential because it provided the intelligence foundation for all other operations. Okay, so while Southern Command is assessing Suriname's military, something strange is happening back in Washington. On November 3rd, 1981, the Pentagon hosted the 14th Annual Conference of American Armies. The meeting was held in strict privacy. You had speeches by Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, and they're all classified. The topic is how to fight Cuban-Soviet invasion in the Americas. Now, Nicaragua had requested an invitation, but they were denied. Conference Secretary General Peter Dawkins said that Nicaragua couldn't attend because attendees, quote, must share common perspectives on defense and security issues. Somebody else at the conference was a little bit more blunt when they said Nicaragua is no more an ally, but they're a Russian surrogate. But Suriname, on the other hand, they were invited, and they sent Major Henk Fernandez, who was one of the top 3 members of the military authority. You had Bauderza, you had Roy Horb, and then you had Henk Fernandez. So that one really has got me scratching my head because Reagan is saying that Suriname is a proxy state. They're aligning with Cuba. They're bringing in Cuban advisors. They're a threat to the hemisphere. But on the other hand, the Pentagon is inviting Bauderza's number 3 guy to come sit in a classified conference about fighting Cuban-Soviet invasion. So Nicaragua, openly Sandinista, ideologically communist, they're excluded. Suriname, supposedly drifting toward Cuba, was welcome in. Now, Suriname's a tiny country, you know, they have 16 sergeants who took over the whole country less than 18 months ago, and the military had about 800 people in 1980 and a couple thousand in 82, 83. So it's difficult to say how many officers that they had, but it's not that many. So he's letting his top people train in America, learn American military doctrine, attend American strategic conferences. So it's hard to tell whether Reagan's rhetoric about Bauderza was exaggerated. Maybe the Pentagon didn't think that Suriname was lost to communism. Maybe they still viewed Bauderza as an opportunity to be brought back into the fold. Or maybe they were just doing an assessment of Fernandez, seeing if he was truly loyal to Bauderza, testing whether he could be cultivated as an alternative leader. Or maybe it was just a warning, you know, to let Fernandez see what they were all plotting and planning there for Central and South America and let him go back and report it to Bauderza that this is the machinery. This is what happens to countries that align with Cuba and don't change course. Or then again, maybe Bauderza was smarter than they all thought. Maybe he sent Fernandez in to spy to see what the Americans were planning. He had set up his own military intelligence unit that summer. So maybe he wanted to understand the regional conditions and to prepare for it, but somehow he both visited Cuba and Castro. He announced the formation of the Revolutionary Front. He sent Fernandez and 2 officers to learn in America. And it looked like Bauderza was doing what he'd always done, is just keeping everybody guessing, you know, accept help from anybody who would offer it, learn from everybody, but trust nobody. So whatever his reasons were, Fernandez sat in that conference room and he listened. And General Meyer talked about Cuban-Soviet invasions. Secretary Weinberger explained that, quote, if necessary, we'll use weapons before they do. Conference participants, they debated terminology. Should they use the word communist or Marxist subversion, or should they call them revolutionaries or terrorists? They decided we're never saying revolutionaries, we're always saying terrorists. So the conference made these decisions. You know, permanent headquarters would be established as a clearinghouse. A data center would track subversives across borders. An Inter-American Police Academy would move from Panama over to Honduras. And Fernandez heard all of this stuff. And whether he was there as Bowders a spy or as an American asset or simply a representative of a small country trying to navigate between these superpowers, he learned what was being planned. And 3 weeks after that conference, back on November 16th, the National Security Council authorized Caribbean Basin operations with NSDD-17. And 6 weeks after that, the bird watchers, the Delta Force JSOC personnel, would arrive in Paramaribo. And Major Hank Fernandez, well, we'll tell you what happened to him a little bit later. Okay, now let's get on to the human infrastructure. Military exercises and Delta Force reconnaissance were only part of the preparation. The real sophistication of the Brazil model was its human intelligence infrastructure, and that infrastructure had began developing since April of 1980, long before Reagan had taken office. By the time of the November meeting, the NSC meetings that had happened, American diplomats in Suriname had already spent 18 months building relationships, learning the culture, mapping the human terrain. Embassy reports show that personnel with Dutch language skills had established deep access to academics, politicians, and opposition networks within inside of Suriname. And they'd begin doing this under an ambassador who knew exactly what he was building, John Crowley, the labor specialist we talked about. So Crowley's entire career had prepared him for this moment. His University of Wisconsin labor training, labor officer in Brussels during the Cold War, his deputy chief of mission in the Dominican Republic after the invasion. When he arrived in Suriname in July of 1980, 5 months after Bowders' coup, he spent 18 months systematically mapping the labor landscape, building relationships with union leaders, understanding who had influence, who had ambitions, who could be cultivated. Sources inside the embassy later described how this worked in practice. So, consular officers would build genuine friendships with local professors and politicians and community leaders. Not intelligence operations, but actual friendships based on cultural affinity and shared languages. These relationships generated valuable intelligence through normal conversations, through participation in social events, through cultural immersion that most American diplomats never achieved. One officer who had been pulled from his posting in India early because the State Department needs someone who actually spoke Dutch. You got to remember, Ambassador Crowley didn't speak Dutch. There's a letter that he drafted with, I think, Senator Paul Tsongas, where he says that he had picked up a book on studying Dutch on the way down to Suriname, so he was learning it on the fly. So this officer that they had pulled from India because they needed someone who spoke Dutch, he arrived in 1980, just weeks after Bowders' coup. He wasn't a spy. He was actually doing consular work, issuing visas, helping American citizens, building goodwill. But he had exactly the right skills, Dutch language, cultural understanding, the ability to move through Surinamese society in ways that other Americans couldn't. At embassy receptions, Surinamese would walk past the ambassador just to talk to the consular officer. That annoyed Crowley a bit, but it gave the consular officer access that no other American diplomats could match. He became friends with people like Professor Bal Omra Singh, a biochemistry professor at the University of Suriname Medical School. Omra Singh had served in parliament before the sergeant's coup. He was watching his country's revolutionary promise deteriorate into military authoritarianism. So this wasn't tradecraft, it was a genuine friendship, at least it appears to be from the surface. You have two people who shared cultural background and language, who enjoyed each other's company, who talked about politics and family and life in Suriname. But it was generating intelligence, systematic intelligence about political developments, military tensions, and opposition planning. And when the Reagan administration activated their shadow government authorities in 1981, so they didn't need to start from scratch. They already had a perfect foundation in place from the Carter administration's old school diplomatic efforts in the embassy. All they really needed to do was to weaponize that system. Now, sources inside the embassy describe what happened next as a fundamental shift in how operations were being conducted. So before 1981, you have genuine relationship building with long-term strategic understanding. After 1981, you have exploitation of those relationships for short-term operational gains. The people who had built the relationships didn't always even know that the shift had happened. They thought they were still doing your traditional diplomatic work. So somewhere before January of 1982, U.S. Army Reserve Lieutenant Colonel Albert Bob Buys arrived in Paramaribo as the new defense attaché. So on paper, his job should have been pretty simple. Be the military liaison between the U.S. and Suriname armed forces. Attend ceremonies, make nice, write up reports, all that good stuff. But Buys wasn't your standard American military officer trying to figure out a foreign country. He was born in the Dutch East Indies to Dutch parents. His father had survived a Japanese POW camp during World War II. Then the family moved to the United States when Bob was 21 years old. He grew up speaking Dutch, so it was his first language. He understood colonial dynamics in a way that most Americans probably never would. So this made him invaluable when it came to Suriname, a former Dutch colony where the elite still spoke Dutch, where colonial relationships were still shaping a lot of things. And an American who could move through a world like that, where a translator normally would be required, was invaluable. But there was another advantage to having a Dutch speaker as the defense attaché. The Netherlands had not stopped caring about what was happening in Suriname just because they were independent. They had major economic interests there, bauxite mining, trade relationships, cultural ties. And like any former colonial power was watching over its old territory, and they were watching it slide toward chaos, they had intelligence officers that were also on the ground. So the Dutch intelligence service, the BVD, was watching Bouterse closely. They were worried about Cuban influence, they were tracking Soviet advisors, and they were trying to protect Dutch interests and Dutch citizens that were still living in Suriname. So for most American intelligence officers, coordinating with the Dutch would have required going through official channels and having Dutch translators, formal liaison meetings. Everything would have to be slow and very documented. But Buys, he could just talk to them, same language, same cultural reference points. He understood all the dynamics that came from his own personal lived experience, not from a briefing document. And he could coordinate with intelligence sources, compare notes on what they were seeing, and even maybe get access to Dutch sources and networks that would never talk to an obvious American. And this is how activity works in the intelligence community amongst allies. It's not all spy versus spy stuff. Sometimes it's just two guys who talk the same language, comparing notes over coffee or a beer about the dictator they're both watching, and nobody has time to write a memo about it. But then the rules changed dramatically overnight. So you might remember that executive order that I talked about that was signed in December 4th, 1981. President Reagan signed Executive Order 12333, and it sounds bureaucratic, like just another paperwork and a stack of executive orders, but it fundamentally rewrote the entire rules of how defense attachés operated around the world. So before this, defense attachés were mostly military diplomats. They represented the Pentagon, they wrote reports, they kept things friendly. But after December 4th, 1981, the order explicitly gave defense attachés the authority to, quote, collect intelligence through clandestine means, end quote. It authorized them to use their diplomatic positions as cover for intelligence operations, and it put them directly under the control of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon's spy service. So, in other words, it changed the job description overnight from military diplomat who occasionally gathers information to intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover. And the timing really tells us everything, because Executive Order 12333 was signed in December 81, and the Southcom team visited Suriname in November 81 to assess military capabilities. And this is exactly when Buys arrived. We don't know exactly when he arrived. We know he's on the roster for January of 1982. So it's possible that he arrived sometime between summer of 1981 and fall or winter of 1981. But there he was, a Dutch-speaking Army Reserve officer with exactly the right background on the ground in Paramaribo as defense attaché. And that's not coincidence. That's just strategic planning. Now, his job officially was to liaison with Bouders's military, but his actual job, he's there mapping weaknesses in the armed forces, identifying which officers might be willing to turn within Bouders's camp, figuring out exactly what an invasion would look like if it came to that. And he's doing all of that while maintaining this fiction that he's just there to build military-to-military relationships. So the consular officer who'd been building friendships since 1980 probably didn't even know that this new defense attaché was operating under these new rules and different orders. He was from a different era, the Carter era. This is the Reagan rules, different missions, and different personnel. The Brazil model had always included a backup plan. In 1964, the CIA was running those 6 tracks against Brazil's President Goulart. They also had positioned an aircraft carrier task force off Brazil's coast. It was called Operation Brother Sam, ready to intervene with military force if the coup failed. So the non-lethal attacks in this situation worked. The coup succeeded and Operation Brother Sam never had to be activated. But it was there, always there. There was a 7th track, military force as a backup plan. 17 years later, in the fall of 1981, the same backup plan was being prepared for Suriname, except for this time it was bigger, more sophisticated, and more rehearsed. As the Reagan administration's concerns about Suriname peaked, the U.S. military was conducting a massive, multifaceted exercise called Ocean Venture 81. This wasn't just a simple drill, it was a global demonstration of force with a very specific, very relevant southern phase. The exact scenario was designed to begin with a regional crisis in the Caribbean, providing them the perfect pretext to move U.S. naval and marine forces into the water right off the coast of South America. So this wasn't an abstract war game. It was marine amphibious units practiced the very kinds of airborne and helicopter assaults needed to seize coastal targets. They rehearsed forced entry operations, securing airfields, and establishing control. It was a dry run for an invasion of a small nation with a vulnerable coastline. The scenario matched Suriname and Grenada almost perfectly. It's almost enough to make you wonder when you have John Bolton 40 years later going on television talking about how he planned coups sometime during his tenure with USAID in 1981 before he left in 1983. And then he gets a trophy that says #1 Reaganite, and he holds up a grenade on the top. Grenada. But we know that the blueprint for Grenada was actually first intended for Suriname. And I'll tell you how we know that here in the next episode or one of the upcoming ones. Just one of those things that makes you go, By the end of 1981, all the non-lethal tracks of the Brazil model were operational in Suriname. Economic warfare. Bolton had mapped out vulnerabilities, aid mechanisms were in place. Political manipulation. The embassy was being prepared for operational personnel. Labor unions. Povenmire had identified Cyril Daal and the Mother Union as the primary target. Ambassador Crowley had spent 18 months building the labor infrastructure. You had propaganda operations. Public affairs infrastructure was being prepared. Military assessment. U.S. Southcom had collected detailed intelligence. Strategic pressure. The framework for escalation was ready. Military backup. Ocean Venture had rehearsed invasion tactics with 20,000 troops. The system was working exactly as designed. Multiple tracks of non-lethal pressure working simultaneously, each track deniable on its own, devastating when combined. But something else was happening in Washington. John Crowley, the labor specialist who had been positioned in Suriname since July of 1980, was leaving. His departure left an 8-month gap before the next ambassador would arrive. That gap would be filled by Richard LaRoche as charge d'affaires. The transition from Crowley to LaRoche marked a fundamental shift, from a labor specialist building infrastructure through normal diplomatic channels to an operational coordinator ready to weaponize everything that Crowley had built. From a legitimate labor intelligence collection to active regime change operations. Democracy was hanging in the balance. President Henk Chin Sen, America's preferred choice, the moderate who Ambassador Nancy Ostrander had personally convinced to stay after the 1980 coup, was locked in a power struggle with Bouterse. Chin Sen wanted elections. He wanted a return to constitutional order. He wanted to chart a middle course between radical leftists and the old colonial establishment. But Bouterse and the Policy Center, dominated by leftist Palu Party, were pushing harder. More alignment with Cuba, more revolutionary rhetoric, no elections. The rift was growing. Both men knew Suriname wasn't big enough for both of their visions. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the shadow government of Bush and Casey had built was preparing for something beyond soft pressure tactics. Next time on the Suriname Contra affair, the Wolf Pack. In January of 1982, the new operators arrived at the U.S. Embassy in Paramaribo. Richard LaRoche, who had been the first American diplomat to meet with Grenada's New Jewel movement, and Maurice Bishop, had filed intelligence reports that had helped plan its eventual overthrow. You also have Edward Donovan, who had actively worked in Brazil under the Brazil model, whose background in psychological operations had suggested a mission far beyond just your routine press relations. And those bird watchers that we discussed from December, they had completed their assessment. The operators were arriving, and Suriname's fragile democracy was about to face its greatest test. Because while Washington was planning regime change, Bouterse was planning survival. And somewhere decisions were being made that would converge in the spring of 1982, decisions that would change Suriname forever. Thanks for joining us. I know this one went a little bit long, so thanks for your patience and sticking it out through the end. Some of these get a little bit bloated because there's a whole lot of sugar to pack in one sack, so I'm not exactly sure every time on where to slice it and dice it, but I don't plan on making them all this long in the future. We'll try to make them a little bit shorter. If you could, go ahead and hit this like and the subscribe button. It really helps the algorithm and help people to get served up content that are interested in these type of things. We love to meet new people. We are growing, which is great to hear. I love all the comments. So make sure to like and subscribe, follow us on Substack, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.